Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would like to continue on this very casual conversation about the Friday the 13th films. Today, I'd like to talk in this, as I say, casual chat. It's not a review, it's just my own memories and experiences with this film from 1984, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. But I will be talking about spoilers and specific details of the plot, so just keep that in mind in case that's of any concern. But in any event, let me now share with you some, as I say, casual thoughts and memories about my experiences with Friday the 13th, the final chapter, directed by Joseph Zito. So what to say about this? I suppose where I can begin is where I've always begun with these videos in the past, which is that I came to the Friday the 13th films in the VHS rental days, so in the 1980s. And the first film I remember seeing first was Part 3. And then I saw them out of order, not on purpose, but due, I think, to accessibility reasons. And so I think Part 5 came after that. And then, so in fact, I remember my experience with this film such that I saw Part 5 before I saw Part 4, or the final chapter. And so whenever I remember that Part 5 talks about Jason Voorhees, what happened to him in kind of vague terms. But it talked about it in this almost legendary status type of way, so that it built up in my own imagination as to the epic nature of what this film must be like, the final chapter. So when it came time to actually watch the film as a kid, I was very excited and thrilled and scared, and it was everything and then some. So that was the general initial thrill aspect of watching this on VHS tape. The other thing too, speaking of VHS tapes, the other thing too is that for me, I should point out that this actual cover that we have on this Blu-ray disc is, I recall, the same or very similar picture art that adorned the VHS box that I remember seeing in VHS stores when I was growing up. So it was this, and the mask and the blood and right. So as you can see, it's very memorable. It's a very vivid image. Whenever I walked into a VHS store, it would be this image, and also Eraserhead, and also Lucio Fulci's Zombie, We Are Going to Eat You. For whatever reason, it's these images that, for me, even now, as I look back on it, best represent in visual terms to me the VHS rental store experience. And it's just, there's something about remembering seeing this in the corner of my eye every single time I would walk into a VHS store. And so this became very integral to my experience with this during this generation, during this time as a part of the VHS rental generation, as it were. So this has a special place because of those associations that I make in my own mind and my own heart. Incidentally, too, on that note, I should point out the great use of the still on the back of the Blu-ray, which is this little picture of Tommy Jarvis wearing the mask and playing the video game at the beginning of the film, or near the beginning there. This is also, if I recall correctly, the same still that was used on the back of the VHS box. And so whenever I see that scene, and wherever I see this particular photo again, I am very pleasantly reminded of the VHS video store experience. And so in that way, this film, and the Friday films in general, but this film specifically, is a great reminder to me of those times as part of, as I say, the VHS rental store generation. Then, as far as the film itself is concerned, I should say that it is, for me, one of my favorites in the series. And it still is because for many reasons, I think. First, again, we have a situation or a plot that involves Jason and events that take place not long after the events of part 3, which took place very shortly after the events of part 2. So in fact, all these events in these films, 2, 3, and now 4, take place within, I understand it, a very short window of time. And so Jason was very busy indeed when we think about everything that happened, part 2, part 3, and then the final chapter. But also, curiously enough, we get this situation where we have, I suppose, a different part of the geography around Crystal Lake. This time the houses here, the Jarvis house, and then the house that's visited by this group of kids, or this group of teenagers. So we have, as we know, an assortment of characters that we find a similar bunch that we saw from the first film, and then the second film, and then the third film. Now we have that continuation of this particular tradition, if you will, in this fourth film, the final chapter. So now, I am very poor with names, and so if I make a mistake, please forgive me and please correct me. But if we were to try to keep track of all the characters we have met, or all the primary characters that we have met thus far in the films, so let's see. In the first film, we had Steve Christie and Alice and Bill and Brenda and Annie, the hitchhiker, as well as Jack, Marcy, and Ned, and Mrs. Voorhees, and also Barry and Claudette. We shouldn't forget those two. Then in part 2, we had, of course, Ginny and Paul, and also Ted, and then Scott, Terry, Mark, Vicky, Sandra, and Jeff, and Muffin. Don't forget Muffin. And Sandra is also very important when we talk about a specific character in the final chapter, so let's keep that in mind. And then in part 3, we had Chris and Rick, and Harold and Edna at the beginning, and Vera, Shelley, and Andy and Debbie, and Chuck and Chili. And so that formed another core group of characters. And then now in part 4, the final chapter, we have, let's talk about the Jarvises. So we have the mother, who I understand is named Tracy, and then Trish and Tommy, and then Gordon the dog. Then as far as the visitors to the house across the way, we have Jimmy and Ted, we have Sarah and Paul, or Polly, and then we have, we have Sam and Polly, Sam and Polly and Paul, and then we have Sarah and Doug, and then we have the twins that they meet later, who are Tina and Terry. Then we also have at the beginning Axel and Nurse, and then we have the hitchhiker, the young lady on the side of the road eating the banana. So I think that is the overview of the characters, and so please forgive me if I made a mistake along the way there, but that's my understanding. So with that, we have, as I say, another very interesting set of characters. First of all, I should point out, talk about characters, a collection of characters whose names begin with T. A lot of that is going on here, right? So Trish, Tommy, Ted, Tracy. So there's a lot of that going on. Then we have, of course, the repeat of names. I think from part 2. So in part 2, we had the Ted character, who I understand didn't end up getting offed by Jason, right? Because he was in town. And then we had Paul, and and Paul and Ginny, of course. So Paul, and then here in the final chapter, we have Ted, and also Paul, or Paulie. Okay, so there's that. Also, we should point out that we get some very surprising moments, I think quite abrupt moments, in terms of the aggressiveness of Jason in this. So I think two examples come to mind for me immediately. First is Axel. I'm sorry, speaking of Axel, I forgot, please forgive me, I forgot part 3 Ali, Fox, and Loco, please forgive me. So the gang, which is also very integral for part 3, so I apologize for that. Let me add those characters. But anyway, going back to part 4, we have the Axel. And this was shocking to me, right? Because this is Fackler from the Police Academy movies, right? So it was shocking to me for a number of reasons. So here, Axel, aka Fackler from Police Academy, he's a bit of a ladies' man, and he's somewhat sleazy in his attempts to try to seduce the nurse. Also, he's watching that very, I guess, interesting, I don't know, erotica, I'm not sure. And so so there's that. And also the way that he's offed, which is very shocking. So we get a lot of the antithesis of the Fackler character that we would otherwise know and love from the Police Academy film. So that was shocking to me. Oh no, look what happened to Fackler. Okay. And then we also get this interesting repetition of Jason and him having to dispatch characters early on. We could probably say in part 2 that it was part of his plan of revenge, because in part 2 it was Alice, and then in part so it was probably a necessity on his part, at least he perceived it to be that way. In part 3, I'm not sure to what extent it was absolutely necessary for Jason to do what he did to Harold and Edna. It's assumed that maybe he needed to regroup, and maybe he was frustrated, which is why he ended up doing what it was he did to those two. But in terms of an absolute necessity, again, I would say it's questionable, but still it happened in the film, okay, and we can accept it on those terms. Here in Final Chapter, we can say that there is probably a degree of necessity in that he has to escape from this hospital place, and also maybe he has to hide what happened to him. And we understand this because Rob, later on in the film, I forgot to mention Rob as part of the characters in part 4. Please forgive me here. So Rob is also a very key character in part 4, Final Chapter. We have this introduction of the violence of Jason, which is then continued on in this really abrupt way with one of the most memorable scenes in my book, in terms of the hitchhiker on the side of the road eating a banana, which is very abrupt. It's almost a kind of parody in the way that it's swift in its abruptness of the flash of violence. It also, of course, marks the return of Jason to this territory, to this area of the world. It's also a reminder of what happens to hitchhikers in this world of Friday the 13th. Very strikingly, of course, Annie from the first film. And so don't hitchhike in a Friday the 13th film because it's bad news, whatever the case may be. And don't eat bananas in this world of Friday the 13th, because that's also bad news, which goes to, I think, what I think to be one of the more interesting points of a film that's filled with interesting points, I might add, which is, there's this thing about Friday the 13th films, as I've mentioned before, about the general perception of the films being about people that are committing these sins, as it were, whether it's maybe engaging in drug use or premarital sexual relations or practical jokes or some kind of bullying or something like that, or maybe bad hygiene. But that becomes a kind of trait, a la Star Trek and wearing a red shirt. But it's really interesting, I think, about how that is played out in this film. Okay, sure, we have, for example, a hitchhiker, and maybe that is indicative of some kind of quote-unquote faux pas in the Friday the 13th world. Okay, but also, bananas, I think, are a great source of nutrition, and one is always encouraged to eat fruits and vegetables, including bananas. And so it's interesting that the choice wasn't that she was drinking alcohol or maybe engaging in some kind of drug use, but it was something that was healthy and wholesome, that is eating a banana. So that is, I think, a very interesting choice. And I might be reading too much into it, but if we think about the other motivations of the other characters that we see in the film, so for example, the relationship between Sam and Paul, right? Because there is a certain sense of jealousy that is generated in the middle of the film when the two twins, Tina and Terry, come. Especially, I understand it's Tina of the two twins. It's Tina who seems to be the more sexually promiscuous, or at least sexually curious of the two. At least she is the one that expresses an attraction towards, first it's, I guess, Paul and then Jimmy, played by Crispin Glover. But this is interesting because then we see the moment where Sam sort of storms out of the house in a jealous fit and goes to the lake, and then we have the scene with her going to the inflatable boat, and what happens to her with right? And then it's interesting because what does Paul do? He, in essence, goes out to the lake. He essentially rejects Tina in favor of trying to show his loyalty and fidelity in the relationship that he has with Sam. So in essence, he goes out of the house in a show of loyalty and love, perhaps, towards Sam. And it's that show of loyalty that it could be said to be his undoing, right? So it's interesting. He is shown to be faithful in the relationship to the point that he goes outside because of his feelings of being faithful. And that leads to his doom. Interesting. Being faithful leads to his doom. That's an interesting concept, I think. Another similar thing happens with Doug, which is another interesting relationship, right? I mean, they aren't married, I think, and they are still young. And so in that way, it goes along this general perceived notion of creating, of sinning or creating faux pas in the Friday the 13th universe. Doug and Sarah, of course. But Sarah is depicted as being a very innocent character. She's maybe curious about sexuality, but she's also very shy. But she's also not just attracted to Doug. She says, right, after, what is it, Doug says, "I think I'm in heaven," and then Sarah says, "I think I'm in love." My goodness. Well, that's another thing too. In these films, don't express your emotions and don't express your dreams. Just like Annie did in the first film, she expressed her dreams at the precise moment she fell victim, unfortunately for her, of course. And then here, it's that moment where she expresses Sarah does, that she goes off, and then Doug, and the thing with the shower there, and then what happens to her, of course. But just before this, she expresses these feelings of love and emotion, which is, I think, very tender. So even in these seemingly innocent portrayals of emotional and sexual exploration, we still get this violent wave that is the attack from Jason Voorhees. So even, right, so that kind of relationship can also be said to be a kind of maybe twist, if you will, on what otherwise might be perceived to be the general traits of committing sins or faux pas in the universe of Friday the 13th. I would suggest also the possibility, anyway, of a similar type of interpretation to be given to the character of Jimmy, the Crispin Glover character, because he is, in essence, trying to establish his manhood in the film. And he is at the age where he is feeling, or he has these urges, these sort of carnal urges, which I don't think is completely against the realm of nature and human beings growing up. I mean, sexuality is a natural aspect of adolescence and puberty. And so this is, I think, a very natural expression of sexual desire and curiosity. And in fact, it's this moment, I think, is in that way not completely. I mean, I don't think. Oh, how should I put it? It's not a moment where I would say is completely one that is quote unquote a kind of sin. Of course, as I say, it is a representative of this universe, as it were, as far as sexual relations go and things of that nature. But there is an expression of sexuality and human sexuality, even in the context of the character of Jimmy, which makes his demise, I think, rather almost tragic in a way. I mean, all he wanted was the corkscrew, but he got it in quite a surprising way, of course, as we know. And he didn't just get the corkscrew, of course, but so there is that aspect of the character. So these, I think, are examples of how, in maybe subtle ways, the film seems to be going against the grain of what otherwise be perceived to be the general critical perception of these films, namely the way in which if someone commits a faux pas here in this universe, they get offed. So, but it's an interesting twist on that. Now, what's also interesting and what I think great about this is how the film tries to tie everything together. We get the wonderful callback to Mrs. Voorhees with the very strategically placed gravestone, the tombstone, which is so visible and so close to the road, by the way. A very interesting choice to bury, right? Okay, so there's that, and then there's also the way that the part 2 Paul by the fireside chat is integrated at the very outset to introduce the film, which is therefore solidifying the iconic status of that fireside Jason myth chat that we saw in part 2. Legendary stuff, and it's used in the introduction to this film so remarkably. And then that leads into a tie-in, primarily of part 2 footage, but there is some part 3 footage as well included, and part 1 footage as well, I should say. But this means that this is establishing the connective tissue, as it were, that this film, the Friday the 13th final chapter film, is, I think, trying not just to establish, but also to extend and to further make its own. And so that is a great way. And also, of course, as we know, one of the ways that this film is trying to tie everything together also is through the character of Rob. And the character of Rob, I think, is an interesting one. It's one where we see a callback to a previous character, of course, Sandra from part 2. And it might beg the question exactly how he got all this information if all the events in part 2, 3, and 4 took place in a relatively short amount of time. But I think we can still reasonably assume that it is possible that he got all this information even with the understanding that the events of part 2 took place just very shortly prior to part 4, because we know that at least in the space of part 3, we know that the news about part 4, the news about was shown on the TV, which is, I think, something that Edna was watching at the beginning of part 3. So we know that those events were made public around part 3 time. So maybe we can understand that maybe Rob got wind of this information around that time, maybe earlier, maybe later, I'm not sure. But it still could give him enough time to do what he did by the time the final chapter comes around. Speaking of Rob, I think he forms a really interesting character as well. He provides that role that we saw kind of, I suppose, fulfilled in earlier characters, like we saw, for instance, maybe in the first film, maybe it was Steve Christie, or more Bill, perhaps. Bill and Alice, there was a moment when they were kind of a team. And then in part 2, Paul, of course, Paul and Ginny. And then in part 3, I suppose it's Rick and Chris. And then now part 4, we have Trish and Rob. So we have that combination, that tag team duo. But of course, in each of those tag team duos, up to now, we always see the male counterpart dispatched quite early. So we saw that with Bill, and then with I guess we saw it with Paul, kind of, but that maybe is an interesting example in and of itself. Then we saw it with Rick, of course, with the right? And now we have Rob with the very famous, or infamous, I suppose, depending on your point of view, moment where he's in the cellar there and it's dark and it's the, oh, he's killing me moment. And I know it's sometimes the subject of some ridicule in terms of the outrageousness of that kind of dialogue. But I always thought that it was a very shocking moment And it's made even more shocking by the fact that it's done in shadow and darkness, so we don't actually see it, but we have to instead rely on the noises, including the dialogue. And so he is almost a witness to, or he is a witness to his own death, which I think is really scary, actually. And so I always took that moment to be not one for ridicule, but one really which is a really terrible and horrible way to end a character. And one, as I say, that we have a certain level of confidence in because of the way he presents not just himself, but also a mastery over the legend and information that is Jason Voorhees. And also his paper clippings, of course, provide that very important plot narrative link in order to give Tommy the idea, in order to change his appearance and become young Jason, if but for a moment, in order to get him off guard, and so you could get the final attack on Jason at the very end, which in itself is a very creepy moment, by the way. So Rob, I think, is very integral in many respects. He also provides, of course, ways in which the film can generate suspense, because we don't know if it's Rob or if we don't know if it's Jason. So that interplay of the use of the POV shots, the use of Rob's clothing, etc., the fact that he also has a machete and that sort of thing, it adds to elements of suspense in the film, of course, right? So, speaking of the Jarvis connection, then we must go to another way in which this film provides a kind of connective tissue with the early Friday the 13th myth, and that is, of course, Tommy Jarvis, and specifically what I referred to just now, which is what Tommy Jarvis does to himself at the very end of the film, which is to try to recreate the look of young Jason in the scene involved, the very famous scene now involving the shaving of the head and some strands of hair left over, and he comes down and he confronts Jason. Don't you remember, Jason? Don't you remember? Which causes Jason to wonder in awe and perhaps a bit of confusion as to what this moment is. Again, catching him off guard just enough for Trish to launch the final attack, of course, knocking off his mask. And then the whole circumstances involving the machete to the side, in glorious, bloody Tom Savini fashion, of course. But this is also, again, a very direct recollection and tie-in to the first film and the presentation of the Jason myth there. So in many ways, it's like the older Jason, which is represented by the Part 2 myth, is confronting the younger Jason, as portrayed by Tommy Jarvis, which is a representation of Jason in the Friday the 13th Part 1 myth. So, as we've noted before, try as we might to try to reconcile these two presentations of the Jason myth, still there is a bit of contradiction that we always must try to deal with. That's part of the fun of thinking of these films, I think. And I always thought that moment between the confrontation of adult Jason and then Tommy Jarvis Jason was in an interesting symbolic way. This way in which the film, the final chapter, was trying to, in one scene, have all of the myths together and embodied in one moment. So, which I thought was really kind of an interesting little symbolic twist on this, what otherwise is a fascinating turn as to how to deal with the overarching mythology of the Friday the 13th universe. Then, of course, that leads into the possibility of what will happen after this film and the Tommy Jarvis character, and that will lead to discussions that are perhaps more relevant to discussions about Part 5, A New Beginning, and then, of course, Part 6, Jason Lives. But the hint or plot thread or feeling in the air is left remaining as to how affected Tommy is by the events of this film, and whether or not that will lead to certain circumstances that will, in essence, resurrect the Jason character in the form of Tommy Jarvis. But we shall see, of course, in later films, right? We shall see. So in those ways, I think we have a great way that this film seems to be wrapping around, trying to tie together the mythology as developed in the previous films. Also, we should say the return of Tom Savini is a wonderful indication of this. And we know Tom Savini's work from the first film, and then now we have him back in the fourth film. And we see the great Tom Savini effect combined with and coupled with the way that the editing is happening. This is very important. Tom Savini's effects are very glorious and bloody, of course, but also part of it, an integral part of it, is the way that it's edited and how the camera shows just enough and then turns away just at the nick of time in order to not just engender the sense of the illusion, but also to prolong the sense of the illusion. As Tom Savini has described it in many an interview, these are illusions and magic tricks, and it's the effect combined with the editing and the pacing of the particular shot that creates the illusion. And we can't linger on too much. We have to cut away just in the nick of time in order to create the effect and have it linger in our minds. And so we get that with almost all of the special effects set pieces here. They happen and they occur in a flash and suddenly, and then they cut away almost as quickly as they occurred. And so that leaves a sense of surprise on the part of the viewer, I would suggest. However, I say almost because we note that the final confrontation with Jason is such that we see the camera linger on the effects. So what happens to his hand and also what happens to his head at the end. It doesn't cut away. The camera stays there. And it really stays there for a prolonged period of time, which I think is indicative of the fact that the subject is Jason, the character himself, rather than the people who are visiting this particular part of the world. And also this is a film that is about, in essence, the death of Jason Voorhees, the end of Jason, after a long series of films leading up to this moment. And so we should linger on this moment as much as possible, and also just to get it established firmly in film terms that Jason is indeed dead. Or is he? Because in fact there's also a way of looking at this actual effect, right? Why did they choose this kind of effect rather than that kind of effect, that sort of thing? Which leads to the question that perhaps this is the type of death that still leaves the body of Jason intact, right? I mean, if it were me, right, in that situation, and you wanted to absolutely secure that this monster villain were truly defeated, then you would do everything you can to make sure that the body itself is just right. You don't want the body to return in any kind of fashion that we will end up seeing in later films, of course. So you want to be sure that everything is taken care of in that department. And so perhaps this to what happens here, and then of course what happens afterwards in that wonderful slow motion effect that we saw in part 1 and part 2, although we didn't see the slow motion effect applied in the same way in part 3, but I'm talking about when we see Trish, Tommy, and then Tommy, of course, die in that slow motion, creepy way with the music, da da da, that very iconic scene in Friday the 13th lore. But the point is that it's the end of Jason, but it's done in a way that perhaps leaves room, and perhaps strategically and purposely so, for the potential for more films to come in the series. And in fact, that's indeed what happens. Although there are some twists along the way, as we will suggest and discuss when, if and when we have a discussion about, say, for example, the next film, Part 5. So that is, I think, in essence, my general approach to this film, the final chapter. I don't consider myself to be an expert in the Friday the 13th lore or universe, but this is, as I say, my experience with this film growing up. And just to conclude, I should say that I think that for me, it would rank as among my favorites in the series. I should say also, if I didn't mention already, when we were talking about all the characters, talk about a collection of characters whose first names begin with T, the letter T: Ted, Trish, Tommy. I think the mother's name is Tracy as well. So yeah, lots of T names as well. Wow. And also Gordon the dog. Gordon the dog is another one of the animal characters. We saw, of course, Muffin in part 2. And so we have Gordon here in part 4. And as I was saying then, to conclude, yes, this is probably going to fall among my favorites of the Friday the 13th films. I'm not sure if it's my absolute favorite of the films, but it is among my favorites because of the many, I think, iconic moments that we see. Right, there's much to be said about, for example, the Crispin Glover dance, although there would be an interesting, it's interesting to imagine a dance-off between Jimmy in part 4 and Violet in part 5, and I'll get to Violet, of course, in part 5 and other characters there. So it's interesting to see if they were competing in a dance-off, who would win in a dance-off. Some people might say Crispin Glover because of the uniqueness of the dance, but maybe there's a certain skill associated with Violet. But again, that's interesting topic of conversation maybe for another video. And there are, as I say, iconic moments as well. I mentioned as the shock factor of a lot of scenes here and the brutality of Jason. We see a lot of door crashing Jason. We saw a bit of it, of course, in part 3 at the very end there with the so-called kind of dream sequence sort of ending from that film. But here we get some really brutal door crashes and the like, and more rain. Of course, what's a Friday the 13th film without a rainstorm of some kind? Here we get a lot of rainstorms and a lot of rainfall. And curiously enough, the characters seem to be comfortable to walk around in this heavy rain without umbrellas. So that shows a lot of fortitude and physical prowess and stamina on the part of the characters, Trish and Rob, etc., and Mrs. Jarvis, etc. So good for these characters and their physical fortitude. So in conclusion, this is one of my favorite films in the Friday the 13th series, and it's scary and gross, and but it's also a further example and perpetuation and a further establishment of the Friday the 13th mythology. And it's also a conclusion, but it's also a starting off point. So in many ways, it's many things at once, which makes it, I think, a fascinating example in the Friday the 13th series. So this is Friday the 13th, the final chapter. And that's it for now. So thank you very much, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.